Hello, friends. I'm a member of a slam poetry scene. Basically, it's an excuse to get people to listen to performance poetry by adding a competitive element of things. After running through a small scene in my city, I wanted to breach out to push my career further. I started visiting places within driving distance that I could spit, but this led me to Charlotte, North Carolina. I started at their local teen venue, where you compete to be part of a squad that goes to a national competition every year. I was doing well and was accepted to the local crew pretty readily. This length of longer stays and features, as some of the other venues in the city I started going to, one that was particularly popular and good for selling CDs. And that's where I met him. He worked as a bar back, occasionally got on stage, and shared frankly bad poems. He was the brother of the hosts, and everyone knew and liked him. He slowly started flirting with me more and more. Although in my loose days, searching for acceptance and love everywhere, something was kept me leery. I really accepted drinks he sent over, smoke his weed with a group in the stockroom between sets, and hang out at parties and events. But I always had this tickle in my gut warning me not to get too close. But over a year or two, we continued to become friends. After a while, he started calling me and texting me more, poking me on Facebook daily, then sending me messages about wanting to be more than friends. And then he wanted to find his snow bunny. Yes, I'm white and he's black. Again, I never entertained it. There was something wrong at me. But the crazy in his eyes was too hard to miss. I eventually moved to Denver to take a position teaching poetry and work at a fret saw firm. The second Christmas I was there, I got a call from a friend from Charlotte, relating the following. He had found this white girl and got married. They seemed happy at first, but slowly became fighting more and more. It spilled over into the venue, and often they had to be separated by friends from physically attacking one another in public. One friend, later thinking back, remembers the last time she saw them together. Him pushing his wife, followed by her throwing a drink in his face and scratching his neck deep enough to draw blood. She said after the couple had been dragged away from each other, she sat with him and smoked a cigarette. She says he laughed and said, "You guys are going to kill each other." Around Christmas last year, his wife just stopped coming to the bi-weekly events they both attended regularly. He explained it away that they were on a break. The time goes by and no one really questions that they hadn't seen or heard from her in a while, thinking she was just breaking the whole scene in order to put a distance between herself and her husband. Her parents, however, hadn't heard from their daughter since Thanksgiving dinner. They would call him and he would say everything was fine and blow them off. And this continued until we kept her Christmas, knowing their daughter would never miss a holiday, with at least call. They call the police and send them to the couple's home for a welfare check. The cops arrived, knock on the door, and I'll let in. In the action where she is, he replied that she's in the bedroom. He shows them to the room, and there she lay dead for weeks, rotting in their bed. During this time, he had been attending events, hosting hip-hop nights, and even publishing a blog on how to make marriage work on one of the local organization sites. Never once letting on that every night he was going home and sleeping with his murdered wife. The sickest part of it all is that he has a child from another relationship, a daughter who he gets to celebrate every other holiday with. That Christmas, they opened gifts and had dinner cuddled up on the couch and watching movies, less than 100 feet away from her decaying stepmother. I don't know what would have happened if I've ever taken him up on his offer to date, but I do know me and my gut are going to stay on speaking terms. And I will always, always listen. We moved to Connecticut the summer before I entered 6th grade in 2001. We moved into a beautiful new house in one of the most beautiful towns I've ever seen. It was a bit more rural than we were used to in New Jersey, but it was an adjustment. My sister is 2 years younger than me, and she was going into the 4th grade at the time. We came from a neighborhood where we were all super close and everyone knew one another. Block parties every summer and kids running back and forth to one another's houses, and we were sad to leave it. Within the first few weeks, we met some of our neighbors. Everyone was what we would soon define as very Connecticut. It was all a bit surface, and nobody had that New Jersey warmth that we were used to. In particular, our neighbors directly across the street seemed a bit odd. The mom would come over to vent to my mom about her sons and husbands, and my mom was a sweetheart and was very welcoming and warm. The holidays came around and the neighbor boy across the street was in my sister's 4th grade class. My sister came back slightly alarmed with what had happened in class that day. The students were asked to make a Thanksgiving turkey out of the tree's drawing of their hands. On each finger, they were supposed to write things that they were thankful for. The neighbor boy wrote things like being a loser, hating myself, etc. Very, very dark things for a fourth grader. Fast forward to Christmas, and my mom hears that they have nowhere to go for the holidays. So she politely invites the mother and two of her sons to our annual Christmas Eve party. The boys were so strange. They listened to Japanese techno with headphones on and didn't speak to anyone. They headed straight to our basement to play video games. It was weird. The younger one, though, was always much stranger than the older one. And the neighbor mom would always open up to my mom and aunt about how he would hurt himself and how he needed to be put on special needs programs, but that he could never quite be diagnosed. They thought he was on the spectrum at first, but that quickly proved to not be the case. We always assumed that she'd been confiding in them because my aunt was experienced with special needs kids and that she was looking for advice from her. The Christmas Eve stands out to me because they were in our home in a very intimate setting, but we saw them on a daily basis. My sister and I would come home from school telling my mom about how weird their younger neighbor was and that something was just really off about it. I will never forget her telling us to be nice to him and that we don't know what he's capable of. That struck me as so odd at the time, but we listened. I don't know if his mother told my mom something that scared her or made her say that, or if she just had a gut instinct. Recently, after that, I can't quite remember if this was in middle school or high school. I think it was in 9th grade, and my sister and younger neighbor boy were in 7th, so we all rode the bus together. What my mom said then stuck out in my mind. So today I decided to be friendlier than usual. There was snow on the ground and the younger neighbor boy was drawing something in the snow and muttering to himself. I decided to greet him. "Hey Adam, what's going on? Nice morning today, huh?" He made no eye contact. "I'll bomb you," he said, still making no eye contact. We let it slide. We came home and told my mom and she reiterated, "Just be nice. We have no idea what this kid's capable of." Keep in mind, we were kids and we didn't know what to take seriously and what not to. I wished we had done more. Also keep in mind, he wasn't someone who was bullied or made fun of. He was always off in the sense that he couldn't hold eye contact or hold a conversation, or even a hello. Kids didn't make fun of him, and he was a loner, but it seemed to be by choice. I never knew why we were so cautious or afraid around him. Other than the fact that he showed zero warmth and zero humanity. We knew he had special needs, but we never really second-guessed anything, and just tried to be as polite as possible. When the bus would drop us off at all of our respective houses, he would run all the way up his driveway on the hill with his hands by his sides, and would turn around and make this weird hiss noise at everyone, making calls with his hands. It was always so odd, but again, we were kids, and there's always a couple of kids in school who did little strange things. We took it as just that. They were invited to several Christmas Eve parties, so memories kind of blend here. One year, the neighbor mom started screaming at my innocent grandmother for being a Yankees fan, as she was a Red Sox fan. It was beyond strange, because my grandma's the cutest little lady of all time, and was in no way trying to argue over sports. It was, though, as the woman clearly had a weird switch go off. She was always nice to me, but I'll be honest, we always rolled our eyes every single time my mom invited them over. It was always such forced conversations with her, and as a teenager, I wanted nothing to do with being cornered into another chat. I think she must have been lonely. The following and final year that they were invited to Christmas Eve was when she got into it with my mom about having guns in the house. The boys only attended the first couple of Christmas Eves, so it was just the mom this time around. The topic of guns came up. The neighbor mom started telling mom about how she has guns in the house and how she takes her younger son to the shooting range all the time. My mom said that she didn't agree with having guns in the house. She wasn't trying to argue, but the neighbor mom got out of hand about it, very defensive, and ultimately getting aggressive about how she grew up in New Hampshire, and that's just the way of life out there. The neighbor mom told us about how brilliant her younger son was and that he hacked into some of the government's highest levels of security and that the CIA showed up on his doorstep. We have absolutely no idea if this story is true or not, but this is what she told us. So it became our ongoing joke when anything strange happened in our house. There were a few odd things that happened through the years. Our internet had clearly been messed with. Lights would flicker in the house, and we would joke that it was the younger boy each time. It wasn't until December 14th, 2012 that we knew just what he was capable of. I was out of college and working outside of Philadelphia. My sister's still a student in college, and my youngest brother, a student at the high school. It was the worst day of all of our lives. My dad had heard gunshots in the morning that killed the neighbor mom, Nancy Lanza. He assumed it had been a hunter in the area, maybe a little closer than usual. That is, until the FBI showed up and had to evacuate the house as snipers had lined our driveway. My mom was at the mall and we were all frantically calling one another as the news slowly broke out throughout the day. At first, they had his identity all wrong and said it was his brother, but we knew it had to have been him. Thank God for my mom making sure we were as nice as possible, although I don't know that it would have stopped him. I wish we had done more at the time. I wish we knew to do more at the time. We didn't want to assume the worst out of someone, but I wished we had. Approximately 20 students and 6 teachers were killed at Sandy Hook Elementary School that day. The worst act of evil I've ever experienced so directly in my life, and I hope I will never experience it again. I'm very thankful that we survived growing up across the street from him, but I'm so gutted for those who didn't get so lucky. These were kids, little kids, in a place that should have been the safest haven for them in their youth. I hate it so much. I know I will never see him again, but regardless, Adam Lanza, you sick and twisted individual, I pray and hope to God that we will never see you again. So this happened on Christmas a couple of years ago, when I was spending the holidays with my parents and little brother, all my cousins, aunts, and uncles. We were in the best suburb of Ontario, but we were venturing out into the woods for Christmas, an idea that my parents had for a while. They always loved the idea of being out in a hunting cabin during Christmas with their families. I was 22-year-old female, but at the time I was newly 18, and my little brother Tom was 11. We're really close and do everything together. We also had a dog, a German Shepherd called Trigger, who came along for the ride. He's a real softie, but can be overly protective, especially of my brother Tom. Anyway, we left our house on Christmas Eve at about 2 p.m. and climbed into our dad's truck, filled with all sorts of presents and stuff for the extended family. Tom and I were really excited. Winning each other, Rob and my parents were having friendly conversations as we moved all over the road. We arrived at the village near the cabins we were staying in and caught up with my dad's sister, Billy, along with her husband and 3 kids. They didn't converse for long, but Billy was a bit unsure of where to go from the village to get to the cabins. Someone had helped her out by writing down directions. We soon got back on our way and arrived at the cabins at around 4 p.m., and there was a cluster of them sort of spaced out around the woods. Each family had his own cabin, and that was where everyone could meet up with a pool table in a swimming pool. It was kind of a place we could all just chill together and enjoy each other's company. Anyway, the weather was already really cold when we arrived, and the snow was falling all around us. So as my brother and I unpacked our things into the cabin and we settled down for the night, my dad started a fire while my mom made us dinner. It was great. The Christmas decorations were already up and we played a few board games as the night got darker. Dad, Tom, and I decided before coming on the trip that we would go hunting sometime. So we planned to go the next day. I've been a few times with my dad, but this was Tom's first time. He was only there to watch us though, as he was too young to shoot. It reached about 7 p.m. and my brother and I were getting a bit tired, so we decided to go to bed. My dad kept his rifles in a bag, which he kept out of the bed I was sleeping in. He usually kept them in a lockbox, but there was no point since we were going hunting in the morning. Tom and I shared a room at the end of the cabin, but facing a flowing river. The view was beautiful. Tom and I fell asleep with our dog Trigger lying at the bottom of Tom's bed. Now this is where things begin to get creepy. It was about 3 a.m. when I woke up to Trigger growling. I didn't find this particularly unusual because my dad suffers from insomnia, so sometimes when he can't sleep, he sits in our sitting room at home and watches TV. Like I said, Trigger is extremely overprotective and growls at any noise he hears. But that's why I noticed that there was no light coming from under my door. My dad never just sits in the dark. I whispered to Trigger, telling him to be quiet as Tom slept, but his growling soon turned to barking, which woke him up. He asked what was going on, but I said Sugar must have heard some deer or something outside, and after all, we were in the middle of the woods. Suddenly, our bedroom door swung open, and the light switch was turned on. My eyes stung as I tried to focus on whoever it was at the door. It was my dad. "Were you two laughing just now?" he asked. As I turned to Tom, his eyes wide and his face pale, "No," I replied. And as he moved over toward our curtain, pulling it back, as he looked out into the pitch-black wilderness. "What are you looking at?" Tom asks as our dad closed the curtains again. "Nothing. Just go to sleep." I was kind of creeped out when my dad didn't say anything about what he was doing, but he turned our light off and we tried falling back asleep again. Of course, I couldn't. I was wide awake for the rest of the night, flinching him pretty much every noise. It was about 4:30 a.m. when I finally drifted off, but it must have been moments later when I heard strange crunching noises coming from outside our window. I was sure this wasn't some sort of animal. It sounded like footsteps. I had this overwhelming feeling of fear and pulled the covers over my face as sweat began to cover my forehead. I then heard a faint tapping on our window, which lasted for a good few minutes. I was so petrified I couldn't move, and Trigger was awake by this point as I saw his face turn toward the window, his ears pointed and listening intently. The tapping started again, but louder this time, causing Trigger to bare his teeth. What happened next was the most terrifying thing that has ever happened to me. "I know you're in there, little guy," this deep and husky voice whispered as a horrible shiver went down my spine. "Why don't you come out here and play with me?" Initially, I was filled with rage. I thought it was bound to be one of my cousins playing a stupid prank on us. So I leaned forward and peeked through the gap in my curtain, ready to give them hell for scaring the crap out of us. But standing there, it wasn't any of our cousins. He was a creepy old man who looked around 60. His hair matted and his clothes looked dirty and ancient. He was struggling the window with his hands, breathing on it as he spoke. I went into protective mode. I didn't know what else to do, so I grabbed my dad's hunting rifle from under the bed and I pulled the curtain back. "Get the hell out of here or I'll shoot." I felt adrenaline rush through me as the creepy man's eyes widened, and the most terrifying smile appeared across his face. Trigger began barking louder than I never heard him bark. My parents obviously heard the commotion and came running through to our room, turning the light on. My mom screamed if she saw the old man through the window. Trigger fiercely continued to bark. My dad yelled at the man and telling him that the police were on their way, but the man liked it back into the woods. Tom was petrified, but I was angry more than anything else. How could some psycho do this? I was extremely glad I had a rifle. The cops caught the guy just a few minutes later and arrested him. I found out a couple of days later that the creepy man was homeless and living in the woods, and he was suffering from a lot of mental issues. It scared me to death to think about what could have happened to my brother if I hadn't been there. We spent the remainder of Christmas Day at the cabin, but we stayed in our Aunt Billy's cabin overnights. There was no way we were sleeping in our own, and after that had happened, we went home first thing on Boxing Day and never looked back. My dad only told me the other day that he knew someone was hanging around our cabin, so he intentionally left the rifle in my bed, and just in case I had to use it in self-defense. He did that because he didn't want to scare any of us. He called the cops after you heard the guy laughing outside of his bedroom window and singing nursery rhymes. Safe to say that this was the scariest experience of my life. So a weird, creepy old guy in the middle of the woods. Please, please, let's not meet again. This isn't as crazy as the typical scary stories you usually hear about, but this was pretty terrifying for me personally. For a small bit of background, I'm from a small rural town set on the East Midlands in the UK, and everything is quite spread out. My mom lived on a small street on the edge of town. Her house was tucked up into the corner with very little lighting from the streetlights as the council turned some of them off in certain areas to save money. The street was a dead end and shaped like a T, with my mom living at a dead end at the top on the left. I'm also about 5'2" and weighed about 105 pounds at the time of this happening. The incidents happened on Christmas Eve in 2011 when I was only 21. I was visiting home from my university up north for Christmas, and I'd gone out with some friends from the area to catch up and to celebrate the season. It had gotten late, and I needed to catch a taxi to get home. I didn't want to call my mom at 1 a.m. Christmas morning to come and pick me up, and it was too far to walk. My friends had all headed home as they lived much closer to the town center than I did. Unfortunately, I hadn't realized that the taxi were all charging double fares because it was Christmas, and had only saved about 10 pounds. which was the usual amount it would cost to get me back rather than the 20 pounds it was going to cost me that night. I didn't have my bank card and thought I was going to have to call to wake up my mom after all. When one driver pointed out that it was Christmas, so he would do it for the 10 pounds, he leaned over and opened the passenger door and I climbed in. Now, in the UK, black Hackney cabs don't take passengers in the front seat. You're meant to sit in the back area normally. I was drunk and honestly just so grateful for the ride I didn't think anything of it. I gave him the street name and we set off. The driver seemed very friendly, asking how my night had been and what my Christmas plans were, just regular chatter. At some point I mentioned that I was visiting from university, and he asked what I was studying, to which I replied, motorsport engineering. At this point he became very fascinated with me and what I was studying. He kept making comments about how he would never have imagined a girl as young and as beautiful as me would be interested in cars, and how amazing that was, that he thought it was incredible, etc., etc. I thought it was odd, but I'd had some weird reactions when people found out what I did before, so I just smiled and nodded to keep things friendly. As we were almost at my street, things got weirder. We pulled up on my street a few doors down from my house, and of course it was super dark. I'm drunk, tired, and a bit creeped out by his obsession with me and what I'm studying at this point. He's still going on about how he would have never believed it. I was too pretty for that, and he would love to see me working on cars. So I just tried to give him the money and get out, but he won't take it. He just ignored my hand waving the money around and kept talking. He had also leaned in. I went closer to me. At this point, I tried the door handle to let myself out, but the locks were engaged and I couldn't find a way of unlocking it in the dark. He completely ignored my attempts to open the door and just continues talking to me. I can't remember everything he said, but he mostly carried on the same way he had been, but was making more references about watching me bend over. I was really freaked out by this point. I had tried to say that I needed to go several times, but he just kept ignoring me and saying how incredible I was, despite not even knowing me. We'd been sitting in the dark at the end of the street for about a half an hour at this point, with his engine and lights off. There was no way anyone from the house would have been able to tell there was anyone in the car if they looked out their windows. Then I saw a light turn on in my next-door neighbor's window up the street from us, and I blurted out, "Oh, that must be my mom waiting up for me. I'd better head in before she calls and starts to worry." The look on his face was genuinely terrifying. He looked like a combination of angry and disappointed, and also contemplative, like he was trying to decide something. I waved my money at him yet again and pulled on the door handle, and pop, the locks let me out. I ran all of the way to my front door and let myself in before walking everything behind me and peeking out of the curtains. He didn't drive away for another few minutes, and I remember being aware that he saw me going into my house, and also must have known that I lied about the lie being my mom, and that it wasn't even my house. Luckily, I never saw him again and went back to university 4 days later. I told my mom what happened and she insisted on driving me around for the rest of my stay. To this day, I still get nervous taking taxis, and I always message someone whenever I have to use one so they know where I am and when to expect me. This happened back in the early days of my childhood. I was maybe 12 years old at the time, living just outside of a major city in Australia. It was Christmas Eve, and unlike other countries who've had their white Christmas, Australia's Christmas is smack bang in the middle of summer. So the last place you want to be is indoors, unless for some reason your house has air conditioning, which 90% of the households do not. Since it was Christmas Eve, school kids were on school holidays, so I invited a friend over and convinced my dad to drive us to a swimming pool complex. It's a pretty large place with cheapish food and a huge water slide, so naturally we were pretty content staying there the entire day, spending our parents' money and enjoying the cool water. It started getting later in the day and we were told we had to go soon. We begged and pleaded to stay a little longer, which led to a compromise that we would have to walk home if we didn't leave right now, which we'd actually done a couple of times before, since the pool complex wasn't too far from my house. We agreed, and we said we would be home soon. It didn't actually take us too long before we wanted to leave, since the sun was setting and the place was getting a bit too cold for comfort. We placed towels around our dripping bodies, waved goodbye to the staff at the entrance to the pool, and began the trek home. It usually didn't take us long to get home, but today my friend had the brilliant idea to take a shortcut. which in turn ended up taking us twice the amount of time to get anywhere near my house. He then joked, saying, "At least now we know for next time." I called him an idiot and said we'd better be home by dark. So we're now getting really close to my house, and it was in fact dark out by this time. My phone was dead, so I was trying to speed walk as fast as I could, as I know my parents would be wondering where we were. The shortcut we were on took us through some very dark, isolated streets. The suburban roads were narrow with straight lines stretched apart, leaving long, dim spaces of darkness. This is when we heard a car pull onto our street, and it was about 100 meters behind us. As it got closer to one of the streetlights, we could see that it was a rusty blue van car and Christmas decorations. We immediately laughed and exchanged peculiar glances. Our faces turned to a more unsettled nature when the van started slowly slowing down as it approached us. We then heard a husky voice call out to us. I didn't quite hear what he said, but he was clearly trying to get our attention, and he definitely had it. We finally got a look at this guy, and wow, the smell was the first thing that hit our senses. Try to imagine raw bananas mixed in with a heavy scent of alcohol. I don't know why I said bananas, but that's honestly what it smelled like. He was wearing a Santa hat and asked us if we had been good this year. He then reached into the back of his van and pulled out a red box that had been wrapped like a Christmas present. He then gestured for us to come closer. We said we really needed to be going as our parents would be wondering where we were. He then pulled the greasiest smile I've ever seen and offered to give us a lift to our house. The guy must have been pretty intoxicated to think that this was going to work on us. We said no thank you as our house was just a few blocks over, and then sped up our pace. We thought that this would make the guy go away, but he slowly cruised on the right side of us, trying to persuade us to get into his van, saying that he's got loads of presents in the back of the van, and that he doesn't know what to do with them all. My friend started getting a little impatient and told the guy that we didn't want his greasy presents. This seemed to piss him off, and he told us that we'd be on Santa's naughty list. He then drove 10 meters in front of us, swung his passenger door open and said, "Look, the present is on the seat. Take it, I don't mind." We're now staying as far away from this guy's van as possible, staying off the path and onto people's lawns as we were walking. When we reached the point where we'd been walking past the van, I kid you not, we heard someone sneeze from the back of the van. My eyes locked onto his, and I pulled out my phone, and I said I was calling the police. He spat on the ground in front of us and sped down the road. We then bolted down a side route that I knew took me directly to my house. Our adrenaline kept us fueled enough to run all the way home. When we got to my driveway, we agreed not to tell my parents. They wouldn't let us go out at night again if they knew what happened. I kind of wanted to tell them, but my friend insisted that we should just keep quiet and never take the shortcut ever again. We never saw that man ever again, and I hope no one else ever fell for the fake presents that he was offering. Stay away from Santas driving creepy vans. You have no idea what they're capable of. It was Christmas Eve, and I was a freshman in high school. My family has been split up for some time now, so normally we trade off Christmas Day and Christmas Eve every year. And this year, I had come home early from my grandparents' Christmas party, while everyone else was at my aunts and uncles celebrating. When I was dropped off, my cousins offered to stay with me for a few hours, yet I declined. I thought I could watch some of my new DVDs and get some alone time in the house, which is a rarity. I had noticed an unfamiliar car parked on the street, but didn't think anything of it, considering it was Christmas Eve and probably just the neighbor's relative or something. After I got inside, I walked the door or grabbed snacks and started to settle down. I hadn't been home for more than 15 minutes when there was a knock at the door. I unlocked the door and opened it only a crack to see a man standing there. Dark hair, glasses, slightly overweight, and dressed casually. He didn't look like much of a threat, but my stomach dropped. He then asked, "I was wondering about the car outside. Is it for sale?" I told him I didn't think so. "Is there someone here I can talk to about it?" I then said, "No, you can come back another time," and then shut the door and turned to walk as fast as I possibly could. He then reached for the handle immediately and started pounding on the door. I heard a string of profanities and the pounding stopped. Terrified, I began crawling on the floor to the phone, hoping he wouldn't be able to see me through one of the windows. Then I heard the noises in our house had an open garage door, and it led through the laundry room where the door lock was broken and no one had bothered to fix it. Just then, I heard a man yell and saw the man through the window run to his car and drive off. My uncle had gotten to him just in time and scared the man off. Who knows what would have happened if he hadn't made it home in time? Sadly, we didn't get the plate number and nothing ever came of it, but I'll never be home alone on a holiday ever again.